What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast where we interview creators about where they came from to better understand how they got here. My name's Philip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorpe.
What are we talking about today, Ben?
We're talking to Owen Denis, and he's the creator of a show that was on HBO Max, Infinity Train. It's a show. How do I describe it, Phil? Is it for kids? Is it for adults?
I mean, that's kind of the big crux of the conversation, but yeah, it's a show that bridges that line and asks kind of what well, it's a show that's like for everybody, I guess I'd say, in the best sense. Like, there's something that, like, if you're younger, you can get something out of it, and if you're older, it definitely deals with issues around mental health and depression, divorce, these kind of like more heavy topics that you might not expect given its kind of bright, colorful aesthetic.
Yeah, and I think I got pulled into it. I really had been watching the show for a while and really loved it, and I think I was really drawn into the way that it kind of plays with identity, especially. And I guess maybe just to tee it up, it's a anthology show that follows a different character in each season. And the kind of gist of it is these people get pulled onto this train that's maybe in another dimension, and have to kind of learn some lessons and grow as a person before they're allowed to leave, which in some cases means I think that they basically never get to leave.
Yeah. Ben was definitely the stan before me, so I hopped onto the show after.
As the resident soy boy.
Yeah, the resident cartoon aficionado, Ben Thorpe. We've switched roles. I used to be the anime fanboy growing up, and the roles have changed. But no, I hopped onto it, and it's surprising because, as that description suggests, it's a show that has so many different moving parts, so many different characters, environments, cultures, ideas popping off in it. That it was really interesting to see how it changes and evolves, especially between seasons when it starts following like new characters and things like that. And that was one of the interesting things talking to Owen Denis about the show, is just like, how do you even kind of make that kind of conglomerate, that amalgamation of so many different parts into this kind of very cohesive show in terms of like how the universe is comprised and things like that.
Yeah, and I think we also had a really good, or he had some really good insights on the complications of a show like that when you're trying to pitch it, right? Because I think even as we're kind of struggling to describe, like, yes, it's it's this show that's great. It's, it's got a lot of kind of great moving parts. It's really interesting, but it's complicated and it's doing a lot of different things. And so he kind of talked about like the difficulty of like, well, how do you kind of pitch that to an exec, or like, how do you make the case that this is something that's important and kind of worth watching, basically?
Yeah, and outside of that, I think Owen had a lot of great things to say just about the creative process and how, I don't think that you're going to anticipate the genesis of how this show came to be, and kind of the story, one of the stories he tells that inspired maybe the first kind of ideas around it. So just kind of hearing that, and from his own kind of fun storytelling was really interesting. But yeah, I think the biggest takeaway for me in this interview is just thinking about how hard it is to make kind of more mature cartoons in America, given the fact that things like anime, which have become an international presence, is so prescient within like most American households. It's weird to me to think that it's so hard to make a show like Infinity Train, and Owen does a good job of breaking down, why that is.
Right. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I have like, it's like one group of friends who I think watches a bunch of cartoons and watches a bunch of anime. But then outside of that, when you try to make a pitch to someone for a show and you're like, oh, it's animated, the response I always get is like, oh, I don't, like I don't watch that, or like I'm not. And so it's like there is definitely this kind of bizarre barrier to entry, I think, for people around something that it's like, listen, like it's great. It has it has all these adult themes. It is something that you can get something out of, but there is definitely this, I think, cultural perception that cartoons, if it's animated, it's for children.
For sure. Yeah, and it's Owen. I think Owen has been talking a lot about that recently on Twitter and things like that. Of thinking about pitching animated shows, and the classic response of like, why isn't it live action? you know, and kind of disregarding the fact that it's an art form, and the story could be best told within the genre or the medium that X creator is pitching it as, right? It's not just an arbitrary decision. So I think we get into all of that in the conversation, in addition to a lot of other things. So how about we get to the interview and let everybody hear what we got to say?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, roll the clip.
Owen Denis is a writer, producer, voice actor, and storyboard artist who has worked on animated series like The Regular Show, Infinity Train, and Close Enough, and movies including The Greatest Ape and Regular Show, the movie. Owen, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
So, and I really loved your show, Infinity Train. The show involves characters from our world getting trapped on a train in an alternate dimension, pocket dimension. The train requires that they learn some kind of lesson about themselves before they're allowed to leave. How did you come up with that premise?
I mean, it's kind of funny because that's just the basics of a story. Like that's what every story is. That you go to any story that you can think of that isn't, I guess, basically even like a slice of life is basically a character has some issue, and then they realize something about it, and then they go, oh wait, I should change that. And then that's all stories. Even slice of life stories are that. It's like, hey, I lost my pencil, thanks for getting my pencil back. It's very simple. So like, it was something where we were sort of trying to figure out like, well, how do we what is the purpose of being on this train? What is the meaning of being on this train? What is the metaphor that we're going for? And eventually we sort of just came around to like that there's no reason to go beyond the fact that story already exists, and we should just go with that.
I'm your conductor. One. Once you wipe those groggy little peepers, you'll probably have a lot of questions like, where am I?
Why am I here?
Are snacks provided?
I didn't ask that.
For those of you talking to me like I'm there in real life, I'm not.
So it seemed to fit all the metaphorical stuff we want to do. We're sort of like, the train is life. It'll sort of throw certain obstacles and things at you all the time, and you just have to keep going or until you die. Like, either you get better or you die, and then also you die anyway, I guess.
Even if you get off, you also die.
Yeah, the metaphor isn't perfect, but
Yeah, I think that leads perfectly, because I think that was one of my questions, which is like, what is it, and what does it represent to you? Because in a lot of ways, it, as you're saying, I think it can stand in as an analogy for life. It can stand in as an analogy for society. It can also stand as a kind of meta-narrative way, as like an embodiment of narrative structure. So how do you think about it in those ways?
I think that's part of the fun of it. Is like, I like it when people take their own feelings and experiences and sort of put that project it onto the train for what it represents. Like we've had times where the train is very much representing gigantic systems that exist in the world. We've had times when the train represents just sort of like the first season, which is just like, I'm going into a strange new world that I don't fully understand because my parents are divorcing. So like I don't understand what's happening and I just have to keep going and figure it out. Like it's very I like to leave it open to interpretation. I don't usually tell people what metaphors we might have been going for or not in any particular season or story, because everybody brings their own thing to it. Everybody brings their own thoughts to it. I mean, that's what art is. Like art is an experience between, the piece and the person viewing it. So I want the person viewing it to experience it in the most personal way they can. So we rarely get super specific about what it is that we're doing. It's sort of like I talk about this quite often whenever people ask me this, but I believe very strongly in like death of the author. Just the idea that my interpretation doesn't matter. Like in the end, you had this experience and what you got out of it is what you got out of it. Like whatever it is that I originally intended might be interesting to you, but it doesn't really matter because it doesn't change your personal interaction with the piece.
Yeah, thinking about that, one thing that I found pretty fascinating was, the show is an anthology between the different books. Like each book is kind of it follows a different main character, but even within the individual seasons or books, they're essentially each episode is like its own episodic world that has its own kind of ecosystem, characters, cultures happening. And then, after the first season, each one kind of takes a character that appeared in the last season and makes them kind of like the central heart of the arc. And I'm curious, like, when you were originally coming up with the concept of Infinity Train, was that always the intent that you'd kind of have you'd have like your individual seasons, then you'd take a character from the previous and try to kind of expand upon the world? Or
it was close to the original intent. Like when we were making it, when we were making the first 10 episodes, all we assumed is that there were going to be 10 episodes and that was it. But we built out the whole world and we knew like how the things worked roughly and how, the story that we were going to tell. But at the same time, as we were doing that, we were like, it'd be cool if we could like do a whole story or something based on this character. Oh, well. And then and we just sort of move on, right? Because we only had 10 episodes. So you have to keep very, very focused. And if it was some sort of show that had 50, if we were told straight out, like you're going to get 50 episodes, go do whatever you want, it might have turned into something more traditional. It might have been something that became like, oh, we do a few episodes of Tulip and then maybe the next episode we'll do something just focusing on Grace, or like, there's all these different, the normal way that you would make a show. But because we were very limited, because we were told like, you're going to have 10 episodes, that's what we built the story for. And then at one point they were like, cool, we really like this. Okay, we'll give you 20 episodes. And we were like, we don't, great, thanks. But, we only needed 10. I don't know what to do. And then we came up with the idea of like, well, let's just go all in on this sort of anthology thing and say like, okay, well, the next 10 episodes are going to be a complete story. And then the next 10 episodes will be a complete story. And that way, part of it was just a self-preservation thing where it's sort of like, if they only keep giving you 10 episodes, then you only know that there are 10 episodes coming. So that might be it. That might be the last of it. And you never know when you're going to be canceled. So we just sort of kept going with like, hey, well, I guess we'll do this one and then we'll do this one because this might be the last one and this might be the last one. Okay, well, now this might be the last. It's the same thing. Like Parks and Rec, I think, had that problem a lot where if you read some interviews with them, they talk about how like, yeah, the end of the season always feels like a really big finale, like a really, really big finale. And it's because they were like, we're probably not going to get another one after this. It's just, we had a similar issue.
How stressful was it was it like, how was it kind of scrambling to create a second season? And, what was it like with that kind of on again, off again relationship with, might get greenlit, might not exist after this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't really a scramble to make it. Like they were sort of like, do you want to do this? And We were like, yeah, just give us like a little time to think about it and write it. And they were like, okay. So they gave us some time, and we went away for, a weekend and came up with some of the characters. And it was one of those things where it's like, each of us had come up with so many ideas and thoughts and things when we were brainstorming the first season that it wasn't like we were out of things to do, because we only had 10 episodes. We definitely had more material than 10 episodes worth of material. So it was basically going through everything that we had and being sort of like, what's a direction we'd like to go? Because we also thought that it would be very jarring for the audience to have a different character every season, a different main character that often they'd never met. So that was actually part of our intent with our second season, was we were like, okay, well, Tulip's gone. She's back on the train. Spoiler alert for anybody who's, I don't know why you'd be listening to this, but spoiler alert. Tulip's gone. She's back on the train. She's back home. So we're going to have this next season take place on the train. Tulip can't get back on the train. She's fine. She went home. So, but we don't want the audience to be like, but what happened to Tulip? I miss her. So we were like, well, let's follow the person who has the same voice actress as Tulip. and sort of went with that. And we also, it was also something where we were thinking about various things while we were making it, where it's like, can a denizen of the train leave the train? Can this happen? Can that happen? Because we have all these questions ourselves as writers making this world, and we're sort of like, can this happen? I don't know. And then some of them we sort of like brush aside and go like, don't think about it. And then other ones we're like, no, that's actually a very interesting moral question or philosophical question that we could totally get into. And then Tulip's reflection character, Lake, she was perfect for a lot of the stuff that we wanted to go for. I mean, that's sort of how we work. We work backwards from themes. Usually we go with like, here's something we want to talk about and get into, and then we go back and find like what sort of character would actually fit that idea.
Interesting. Yeah, I was talking to Ben before you came on. I was like so fascinated by just how you came up with the individual trains, and whether the process was like, hey, we want Tulip to experience X part in her emotional arc, and then we're creating a train to allow that to happen. And I think, like I was mentioning the mirror component with Lake in the first season, but then thinking about like the second season, I found that there was such a the individual trains, I felt like the connection with the emotional arcs of the characters was so much more under the surface in a great way. And it became just even more exciting to think about like what the next train is going to be, and the characters, especially like the animal characters. I don't even know how you came up with things like Alan Dracula and Toad and Atticus.
Yeah. We generally try to work backwards from a theme of some kind that we're thinking about at that particular time, and then think about like, how do we what kind of person would best learn from this? So when I was originally thinking of the Infinity Train, I didn't think of Tulip at all, really. I was like, yeah, it's a girl, she gets on a train. I don't know who she is as a person, though, and I was having a lot of trouble figuring it out. But eventually, these women from Google came and gave a talk at Cartoon Network, and they started talking about all the feelings that they have and how they would how they were thinking, how they think, like how they just think in general. And I was like, oh, that's how I imagined Tulip sort of thinking. And then they talked about some of their feelings that they had, and I was like, those are the feelings that she had. And I was like, oh, so these programmers from Google came over and were like, okay, well, I'll make her a programmer. And then I started thinking about like, okay, well, that's actually like the perfect opposite to what the train is. Like, the train is a new experience every single train car. You have no idea what you're going to get into. But she, from her perspective, is like, I want stability. I want things to be the same, and they're not being that way. And so the best way for someone like that to learn that the other way is good too is to constantly be put into a situation that is not the same. And so that's generally how we worked with all the episodes, is you put somebody into a situation that will spur change in some way. And with the first season, it was very like, we were very lesson oriented, I think. because we're still coming off of how Cartoon Network normally did TV shows at the time. And so there was sort of an expected, like, okay, so by the end, they say that they have this lesson and they learned this. And you're like, okay, fine. So you put in this, that sort of moment. But it's very much, that's why the first season feels slightly more episodic, I think. It's sort of like enter a car, leave a car, enter a car, leave a car. And like every episode has that sort of finality to it. Whereas the second and third seasons especially are much more about, there are no actual like stopping points. It's just sort of like a constant feeling of change, a constant feeling of motion.
Yeah, and maybe can you talk a little bit about how you were thinking about making emotional arcs over the course of, I think they're about 10, or is it 10 episodes, about 11 minutes long?
10 episodes.
And so how do you think about, coming to a place where you can create this kind of emotional impact over that length, which is, I think, relatively short?
I mean, it's a movie length. That's 110 minutes, So it's really just, you think of the plot of a movie and what would happen over the course of 110 minutes, and then figure out where can you put these breaking points and how would you spur those breaking points. So it's mostly just a movie with 10 chapters. So the only issue being that like you have to make it exactly 11 minutes. Like that's one of the hard parts, is that because it's for broadcast, you can't go over a couple of seconds here or under a couple seconds there, or even a minute in either direction. And also that's how animation contracts work, is they usually say like this many minutes per contract. So even for, not even just for the people writing the show, but also for the people that are contracted out in like South Korea who are like animating it physically. So you end up having to be very, very specific on like, at this point they will learn this and have this thing happen. At this point, it's very technical, even though it shouldn't be so technical. It kind of is.
Yeah. So like when you alluded a bit to Cartoon Network and kind of how they traditionally wanted more of like an arc where the viewer learns something by the end. I'm curious what it was like pitching a show like Infinity Train, which, has all these kind of these elements that are ever changing, right? It's not like a constant storyline, and it's not episodic, I think, in some ways, in the way that maybe is traditional with other shows that are like on Cartoon Network or, Nickelodeon or whatever. What was that like? What was the kind of like their general read on it, and how was it to pitch?
They were pretty supportive. It was really just it's just something that everybody sort of came to understand was not like normally happens. And so and it was also like the first, I think it was the first show the Cartoon Network had done that was scripted in almost a decade. At that point in Cartoon Network, everything was, the writers come in and they write an outline, and then they hand it to the storyboard artists who do the writing and the drawing of like dialogue and things like that. And so this was the first time that Cartoon Network had been dealing with a script in like, as I said, like a decade. I think the last one was like My Life as a Teenage Robot or something. Might have been the last one. It was something in there. I don't quote me on that. Record me,
Breaking
but don't
news.
quote me. Yeah. But it had been quite a while. So it was there weren't really any, and I had never written scripts, and most of us, I'd always done scripting while boarding. So it was a whole bunch of like learning new things and being like, oh yeah, you have to keep this page limit, or you have to like this much space on a page for this particular kind of dialogue is going to take this long. And it was just, it was a large learning experience, and Cartoon Network was also learning how to deal with that at the same time. So like all of us were kind of like,
I'm maybe on the kind of pitching front. I'm wondering where you can talk about, obviously the show feels like it resonated with me as an adult person. It has a lot of adult themes in it, but what kind of space does it occupy, and like who is it for? Is this a kid show, a show for adults? How do you think about that audience?
I don't care. Like that's the thing is like people when you go in, there's often this like, and so who's the audience for? Who do you want this? This is for children or this is for adults? What do you want? And I'm like, no, anybody can watch this. I don't care. Like I feel like when I was a kid, things were like what counted as something that was for children and what counted as something that was not for children was a lot more gray than it is now. There were the obvious things where it's like, this is Transformers. This is a whatever. This is a show that's here to sell toys, right? But then, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Is that a children's movie or not? Like it's a movie with a whole lot of sexiness in it. It's a movie with people who like melt. Speaking of people who are melting, Indiana Jones, is that a children's movie or not? And these are all movies that, I just go to the library and check out, so I would watch Indiana Jones. And at the end of Indiana Jones, a man's face melts off graphically and it's supposed to be realistic. And another person's head explodes. People get shot. There's a lot of blood. Move on to Temple of Doom. It's only blood. Like there's all these movies that people go like, yeah, that's, sure, a kid can watch that. Sure. And now people are still like, yeah, I'd let my kid watch Indiana Jones. Sure. Because it's like grandfathered in or something because they saw it when they were a kid, but they wouldn't allow some kid to see it now. And so there's always this like, I don't fully buy into the idea that one piece of media is particularly for one kind of person and one is not, and especially because I even remember that like, like when I was a kid also, like I where I grew up was rural Minnesota. So if I, as like a white kid, was into rap music or something, people were like, no, that's not okay. That's not for you. And it's like, it's music. Like, it's music. How can you possibly say to somebody like, no, you can't listen to that music because it's just not for you. And you can't just enjoy a piece of art from anybody. Like it's insane. So I just don't buy into the idea of any of that.
Yeah, and I wonder, does that make it hard? Like, are studios thinking about it in that way, where it's like, okay,
yes, they are. Studios definitely think of it that way. So it's difficult, especially if you want to do something that is not immediately obvious as something that kids can watch. So if you think about Indiana, I'll just keep using the Indiana Jones example. If you were to think about Indiana Jones, the original one, and you said, okay, so I want to make this movie. It's about a guy with a whip and he kills Nazis. And at the end of it, their heads explode. Would you say, yeah, that sounds like something kids will watch? No, absolutely not. You'd be like, oh, whoa, okay, could we pull it back a little bit? That's a bit much. And so, that can be a little hard. So it's the same thing now. If you're pitching something and no one's ever seen it or heard of it, and you say something that might have something like that. So like for example, in Infinity Train, if I say like, yeah, and then we shoot the dog with a gun and the dog turns into this horrible roach monster that tries to suck the soul out of our main character. And I mean, does that immediately strike you as like, yeah, children's stuff? Like, not exactly. It can be, it might not be, but it's in that weird sort of gray zone, So yeah, there's always an issue when pitching to anybody, especially if you have no drawings. Like if you do have drawings, it helps. But if you have no drawings, it's even harder, because if you have drawings, when you're talking about animation, you're talking about something that's abstracted, right? All animation is an abstraction. So if you describe some scene or something to somebody, they're going to have a completely different version in their head of what it looks like. And if you happen to be talking to a person that's going to think the worst possible outcome, they're going to be like, oh my God, some guy's head is going to explode. That means the guts are going to fly all over the camera. It's going to drip down on the screen. This is like rated X stuff. And then like, what, he's going to explode? Is his dick going to fall out and like hit the camera or something? Like, I don't know. I guess, like, who knows? And you know, it freaks people out. So you have to kind of go in with like some drawings to be like, okay, so here's what we're going to do. See how the dog is cute. Therefore, yeah, we're talking about a roach animal or something sucking the life out of somebody, but you know, it's cute, maybe. And then you sort of get in there and make whatever you want. After you get in.
Get your foot in the door and then, you know, just go
Yeah.
gung ho. No, I mean, like when
Yeah.
what happened to Atticus was harrowing.
Yeah.
For one. So, yeah, going back to your point about, you know, growing up, how there was much more of a gray area. I feel, you know, I'm 29 and I kind of grew up, you know, like watching cartoons in the late 90s to early 2000s, and it just seems like you said, back then there was so much more room for like these different types of shows, whether it be like I think of like As Told by Ginger or any of the other kinds of cartoons that maybe were anime or like American, like TMNT. I'm thinking of stuff like that.
That's the other thing, is that time period is when a lot more anime started coming over, because like Toonami and stuff, so that became even more like gray and weird, and like kids are watching movies and TV shows and stuff that in Japan are like for adults or teens and stuff. But then like over here it's like 8-year-olds being like, yeah, I can't think of an example off the top of my head,
Right.
but kill him, whatever.
Well, it's just weird that that this mentality that studios have of like it isn't marketable or sellable or whatever they're saying in terms of like these more, you know, darker, quote unquote, or more emotional animated television shows, when there's so many clear examples of them being successful, right? And I'm wondering, like, why do you think that that mentality has persisted?
Well, I mean, that was in the US, that started with I believe it was Disney specifically was pushing for like animation to be for kids, and he pushed that, and Disney was successful at it. I'm talking about like the man, Disney the man.
Not the company right here.
Right, not the company that owns all of us. No, Disney the man. He originally was pushing for, and this is if I'm getting my history right. Again, don't direct your comments at me. Direct them at whoever, you know, whatever website we're on right now. But he specifically thought that there was more money to be made by making cartoons more child friendly, and he started making those decisions with Fantasia, I believe. The original, for example, in the original Fantasia, like he was pushing in Fantasia, which was really cool. But he still was pulling back on a lot of things. So like the original Fantasia, the horse people. What's a horse person called?
Centaur, right?
Centaur. Thank you. Yes, Centaur. The centaurs in that were originally all topless, you know, and it was a late decision to be like, well, let's put like shells on them or something. And so like there were these moments where Disney sort of was like, we could try pushing this new direction, but we want to make this accessible to like children. So he put a real push on children. Then it started getting into the Hanna-Barbera stuff in like the 60s and 70s, where it was just sort of like the cheap animation was like the cheapest thing you could do. So it was like the cheapest thing thrown out to kids or whatever in the morning. And eventually you get into the 80s and stuff, where it was still one of the cheapest things to do, but it was exported to Japan to be made and animated and stuff. But that was like a toy thing based off of what happened with Star Wars. Like when they saw that, oh, kids watched Star Wars and then they bought a bunch of toys. Oh, there's a whole bunch of money that can be made if you make a piece of media and then specifically try to tie it in with products and merchandise. And then you know, it just kind of, that's how it goes. I mean, it just sort of keeps going, because sometimes people seem to have this assumption where it's like, yeah, that that cartoon that was made in the 80s, right? And then, you think like 5 years later, oh, well, why don't they try it now? Well, it's because the people that were in charge in 1985 are still in charge through like 2007, So there's a long tail on like, because these decisions aren't made by like a computer that says, hey, the ratings for this thing are this. They're made by people that have taste or don't have taste. And they say, I want to make this thing, or I don't want to make this thing. And there's always going to be some amount of like, oh, is this going to be commercially successful? If it is not commercially successful, I might lose my job. Like, and there's that sort of play is going on with the executives and stuff. And so they're always sort of nervous about what's going to happen with them. Like there's no executive union that's going to be like, no, you don't get to lose your job because of the union, So it keeps persisting because you have people that get into that position and then they're there for a while and they're told at some point like, hey, that kind of thing doesn't work. And then they go, okay. And that just sort of becomes law in their head. And then it continues. And then sometimes someone will be like, oh, we want to try this new thing. And they try it out. And then they don't really put any like money into it because they're kind of nervous about it. And it becomes this thing like, well, see, there it was. That was a flop. So it proves it. And it's just sort of a thing that just loops and loops and loops. I would say that it is very clear, however, that recently that attitude is changing. It is very clear that attitude is changing, specifically because of things like Netflix sort of become like a new Toonami in a way, where it's like Netflix has all these animes and stuff on there now, and they're starting to realize like, oh, there's like a very specific audience for this. And at this point, media has also become much more specific. Like it's not as broad as it used to be. So you end up with the companies doing like sort of these micro targeting of things like, oh, this show will end up being good for this age of person in the Midwest, and like they'll super target in on that kind of thing. And so you end up with things that are a lot more niche being made now because all these companies are trying to just increase how much stuff they have on their platforms. And at the same time, you have a lot of executives that, are now our age, like I'm 34. So like at this point, I've met executives that sometimes are younger than me. And I've met executives that are the same age as me. And I've of course met executives who are older than me, but there's a new group coming through that is starting to be like, why don't we try this thing? Hey, I have an idea. Try this thing out. And everybody's trying to make their mark. And so people are starting to push into that direction because you end up with people like me who grew up with like video games that are basically movies, at this point, and like watching a wide variety of things. I didn't just like my parents talk about how they grew up with like 5 channels. I didn't grow up with 5 channels. I grew up with hundreds. And so there's just a larger, people have a much larger palette than they used to. And so I think that's starting to be recognized by studios. Definitely with some of the conversations I've had with them, I think it's coming.
Yeah. Within the context of all of that stuff that you just said, where is Infinity Train right now?
What do you mean? Like
what, my understanding is that HBO Max has not picked it up or not renewed it for a new season. Mm-hmm. Where are things moving forward?
As far as Infinity Train goes, it's canceled. Like there's nothing else to it. The issue that ended up happening with Infinity Train, I think, is that it just, it was the wrong time. Like Infinity Train was supposed to come out on HBO Max in the first place, but that was before it was a Trump like stopped the merger between AT&T and Warner. So whatever their streaming service was going to be couldn't be made for like 2 years. And so our show was intended to be on a streaming platform in the first place. It was never supposed to be on Cartoon Network. And so then everything started changing hands and the merger happened, and some like basically every person that I know at Cartoon Network was fired and like just thrown out. And then you've got a bunch of people that aren't really attached to the show. They're like, what's this show? It's some show about trains. I don't know. And then it's just canceled because like no one has because again, these things aren't actually based on numbers. They're based on emotional attachment. And it's based on an executive or something wanting to make more. They will say that it's about numbers, but it's not. It's more of a, it's sort of used to justify whatever the decision is, but the decision in the first place is always gut. So with Infinity Train, it's canceled because I think it's because it got caught up in this big, crazy, shifting, gigantic conglomerate thing. At the same time, like, I don't think it's dead at the same time. Like, it's this weird thing where I'm like, emotionally, I'm in this weird spot where I'm like grieving, and I already grieved, right? I already grieved, and then the 4th season came out, and then I had to re-grieve because all the fans suddenly had to learn that this was the last of it. And, I wasn't allowed to say that it was the last of it. I had to wait until there was like an official announcement. So I had the grieving process, and I started getting over it. And then all the fans started to experience it. And now I have to like go through the whole process again. And it's really, it's tough. It's emotionally exhausting. But, I think it's very clear that like nothing ever seems to die anymore. like I'm surprised we're not seeing like Mrs. Columbo reboots and stuff like that. Like, companies are mining so hard for IP that it's just like, how could they, there's always going to be some ability to reboot something or bring it back. So I view it as like, yeah, okay, the show's canceled. Maybe in 10 years I'll make it more or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's where it is.
I'm curious with I read a quote from you about because you lived in China for a while, and you were talking about being on the plane, I think it was, and falling asleep and waking up and kind of being in this moment of like, where am I? And everybody's looking at their screens. And that in some ways might have influenced this idea of like having these train cars for Infinity Train, these different train cars. And I'm wondering if you could kind of like put us into that headspace you're in and your time in China. Like, what was that part of your life, that journey you were taking to China and that specific moment?
So I used to be an English teacher in China. The way that happened was I was in college and I was like really, really burned out. I was like working all the time, and it was just like animating all the time, and I was completely burned out, and I just couldn't take it anymore. So I was lying on the floor of my apartment, crying, with ants crawling all over me, because we had an ant problem. So ants were crawling all over me, and I was like calling my parents and being like, I hate this. I don't like this. And this was like my junior year of college. I was like, I hate this. Everything sucks. And they were like, well, just go do something completely different. Like, do a completely different thing that has nothing to do with what you are doing right now, and that'll help you. And my mom in the 70s and had been, she worked in Yellowstone, as I think a house cleaner or like in the kitchen or something in Yellowstone. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just go do that. And then I did. And so I went to Yellowstone, where I met a bunch of students from China. And Yellowstone's a really, it's an easy way to get a place to live and make some money, and for like a summer. So it was common to have a lot of people come from overseas to just do this for a couple months, and then maybe they'll like drive around the US and then they'll go home, which is just a great way to do like a vacation kind of. So I met a bunch of students from China, and they were like, we really like the way that you explain English words to us. Like, your definitions are really good. And I was like, all right. and they were like, you should go be an English teacher. And I was like, that's not how it works. And then I researched it, and it turns out that's exactly how it works. At the time, at least in China, all you had to do was have a 4-year degree of some kind, any kind. You have to have been a native born person in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or the UK. So someplace that speaks English natively. And you had to pass a 2-week course on how to be an English teacher. So I did the 2-week course over in China, and then I was put into this school. And so I was teaching in China for 3 years. It's an exact number. I was teaching there for 3 years, and it was a really big experience. Like, it was a very mind-opening experience. Like, you don't realize that you're in a culture until you're no longer in the culture. So, I always thought, like, when I met those students from China, I was like, oh, they're kind of intriguing. I don't know. They're all kind of odd, and they're very interesting people. I don't know. And then when I went there, I was like, oh, okay. It's just straight up, this is a cultural thing. Like, whatever it was that I saw my friend doing was like just sort of a cultural thing. And then when I went there, I was like, oh, this is not just my friend who was doing this. This is a whole culture. And then I realized, I started realizing, like, oh, I'm American. Like, sometimes you don't realize, like, oh, I am definitely an American. And I had no idea what that meant until I went someplace and lived there for a while. And not just like visit, I mean, like, live there and be there. I had no idea what that meant until I did that. And so I would sometimes fly once every summer. I would fly home to America, and so I got on this plane and I started flying. There's this big part of the ocean that's very, very quiet. There's just nothing there. It's completely silent. And there's also no turbulence. Because there's nothing out there. It's just this big plane of water. And so I had fallen asleep, and I'd woken up right in that particular moment when we're in this big quiet part of the ocean. And I looked around, and I was surrounded by people that were like staring into TV screens or were asleep or something. And I was like, it was just a small moment of like, whoa, what's going on? And looking around and being like, oh yeah, that's and that's a sort of scary feeling, the idea of being someplace that you're not expecting and you don't understand what it is. Which is kind of my whole experience in China, really. And so I just tried to sort of capture that idea in that moment of like waking up in an unexpected place where you don't know what to do and you don't understand, and you have to get out, but you don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know anything about anything. Because also, like, when I first went to China, I didn't know how to speak Chinese. I went to China, and I knew how to say one thing in Chinese. I didn't even look up how to say hello before I went to China. That's how stupid I was. So I didn't even look at how to say hello. I knew how to say one thing in Chinese, and it was to impress a girl who was speaking Chinese, who was Chinese. And it was 我觉得你很可爱, which just means I think you're cute. And that's the only Chinese that I knew when I went to China, which, again, I do not recommend that. I would recommend that if you ever decide to go live in another country, maybe at least learn a little more than that.
That's so funny. I did an exchange year in Germany, and it was a similar thing where it was like, went with zero prep, should have gone with a whole bunch of prep, and then got there and was like, I have made a series of very critical errors that have gotten me to this place. And I guess I just have to, like, I'm trapped in this place for like at least a year. Guess I just got to figure out the rules and hope that things work out.
that's basically exactly what happened, and wouldn't change a bit of it. I'm really glad. I'm really glad that I experienced it.
This is an endorsement for traveling abroad. All right, cool.
Yes, you should go travel. It's fun. It's good for you.
One of the things that you mentioned before that I'm kind of curious about is like maybe you can talk about your relationship to video games. I had kind of seen in an interview that Ashley Johnson, who plays Tulip and Mirror Tulip, the voice of, you kind of came to her through The Last of Us. And so, yeah, maybe you just want to talk about maybe growing up, what was your relationship to things like video games, and how does something like that play into the shows that you make?
I remember the first computer that we got, which seems like an unusual thing to have a memory of. Like, I feel like at this point, everybody who is, in the US, the average person will have some computer in their house already, or a smartphone or something like that. So the day you're born, you already have a computer. But I do remember when the first time that we ever had a computer in our house. I was, I want to say like 4 or 5, something like that. And my dad bought a computer, and it had DOS on it. And there were some games on it that were like there were some games on it that were like these very simple sort of adventure point and click games. There was one called, I think it was called like The Prisoner or something. But I couldn't read. So what I would do is I would try to play these adventure point and click games where you had to read and learn things from reading. And I couldn't. So what I would do is I'd be like clicking and trying to get further through this game and just sort of hoping that I clicked the right spot on the screen somewhere. And then that was sort of my early introduction to like games and stuff, was that it's always a mystery. I cannot read it. I don't know what's going to happen. So just going into it completely blind and then just hoping that whatever it is sort of works out. So that was a big one. I remember watching my mom play Myst when I was a really little kid. And my mom was really into Myst. She loved it. And so I'd watch her, and it was this eerie sort of location. Like, Myst is a very eerie game. There's nobody around. It's just these still pictures of 3D environments that you sort of click through. And I just remember, like, my mom was into adventure games too. So like my mom was into, that's why I played it when I was like 4 or 5, is because, my mom was getting these games and playing them. So I'd play Myst, and I played, King's Quest, and like these various games that were just adventure games that often had a whole lot of reading that I could not do. And I remember getting a little older and realizing that I knew how to read. So I could probably try them again. So I tried them again, and they were a lot easier, first off, when you can read. And, that was just like, that was sort of the sort of games that I got into. It was like these very point and click adventure games, because they also were just, at the time, they were the most beautiful games that you could see. Like now, if you go into like any sort of big AAA game, all the graphics are like this incredible real-time 3D whatever. But at the time, if you wanted 3D, it had to be a pre-rendered image that you could just look at and it was still. And if you wanted graphics that moved around, they were pixel graphics, or they were just sprites. And so you couldn't really, it wasn't like this beautiful image to just like absorb as a piece of art, So, which you can do now with these big AAA games. But at the time, if you want to just absorb an image and absorb the feeling and the tone and everything about it as just a piece of art, it would had to be in a point and click adventure game. So I just got really into them, and I was really into like 3D modeling and rendering and things like that when I was a teenager, which again, all this sounds like I keep saying like at the time, but it is, I was 12 years old in rural Minnesota in the early 2000s. There weren't really any 3D schools. Like you couldn't learn how to do 3D stuff by going onto the internet and going like, oh yeah, I'll just use this program and whatever. It was like my dad had to go to the store and pick out a piece of 3D software that looked like it would probably be fine and it would work, and then I'd use that, and that was it. That's how I learned anything having to do with 3D. So it was just I really wanted to go into like 3D animation and 3D graphics and stuff, because at the time it was this incredibly new like art form that everybody was really into, where it was like, have you seen this movie? It's called The Matrix. They used computers in it. And you're like, whoa. Or like, you know, the Pixar movies, and like all these movies started becoming 3D for the first time. And that was like this really cool, brand new thing. And so it was a very inspiring time to like do that sort of stuff. And so that, all those sort of things sort of combined into like, oh, I love video games. Oh, I love this 3D stuff. Oh, I love making levels in like Half-Life or like Counter-Strike or like Unreal Tournament, like things like that. You like make levels in 3D, and like it was, you know, it was a fun, very experimental thing, but it all had to be figured out on my own, because there just weren't there was no way to learn. Like it was a book maybe, but it was specific to whatever program that person had or something. It was difficult, but that's generally how I got into animation and stuff in the first place.
Again, like another interview I was reading of yours, you were talking about Myst and point and click adventure games, and I just feel like there's such a point of DNA from that in the concept of Infinity Train, of you talking about like drawing rooms on index cards, and you know, you'd like click a door and go into the next one. And I feel like that's, in a very small kind of way, like that is kind of like how Infinity Train operates. Like you're going into these different rooms, there's a task that needs to be fulfilled in order to progress. And yeah, it's interesting just thinking about how those things from way back when you're a kid can so easily you know, map themselves into the things that we're creating later on.
Yeah, it's funny because I think about like, I have a friend who has a daughter, and she sometimes like the way she does like pretend stuff is she pretends to be like a YouTuber, where she's like talking to the camera and like showing off some soap or something that she has. And like, so whenever it is that she starts making stuff professionally or something, you know, in 10, 20 years, that's probably the sort of things that are going to inspire that person. Just like when I was a kid, I was like, yeah, I'm really into these point and click games. So I would make point and click games out of index cards that I drew pictures on. You know, it's the same sort of like, you know, you see it, you do it, and then it just becomes sort of like ingrained in your soul.
Yeah. What was it like? You know, Ben and I were both writers, and we, you know, we collaborate on other things besides this podcast. And something that I was just interested in talking to you about is thinking about Infinity Train, and especially book one. It feels, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like it's such a deeply personal project. And I'm wondering what it was like, you know, from the conception of it, you know, sharing that vision with the team that you ended up assembling. What was that process like, kind of sharing this very deeply personal project and then translating it into something that can be a collaborative thing that can be riffed upon and expanded upon?
Well, it helps just going into any project being like, I don't know what I'm talking about. Just ready to listen to what other people are going to say. That's a big part of it. You know, a big part of it. That's funny. A big part of it is listening to people and making sure that the people who are in the room are people that are empathetic, who empathy is like a big one, who are imaginative, empathetic, and often, you know, you want to make sure that they have the experiences that these characters have had. You know, if you're trying to be truthful, it has to come from a place of truth. And, you know, I didn't personally, like, my parents did not get divorced. They didn't get divorced. They're fine, whatever. However, I knew a lot of kids growing up who did. Like, almost half of my friends when I was a kid their parents were either divorced by the time that I knew them, or they got divorced while I knew them. And our house was often used as a place where they would go when things were bad at their house. So I learned a lot about the feelings, because these were feelings that I didn't have, but I was watching my friends have these feelings. And so it was a lot of like learning to understand like what is happening with them, why are they thinking what they're thinking, doing what they're doing. And so when making a show, it's important that you say these sorts of experiences. You go like, these are the experiences that I had, these are the experiences, the emotions that I remember having. What did you feel and remember? And so, you know, on our show, we have two of our writers had parents who had gotten divorced, and they were very specific on saying like, well, this is what I was feeling. This is what it's like. It was a very raw thing for them to write the show. And so they were like, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I was feeling. These are some experiences that happened while that was happening. And you know, it's really just a like, okay, I have an idea for a show. It's about this thing. I might not have enough experience to do this, so I need to talk to people who do and get them involved as much as I can in the process. So that's what I did. It's similar to like, you know, in later seasons, we also made sure to have like consultants on and stuff for things that we, you know, it would be like, I don't have this experience. I don't have whatever this is that might be needed in this season. So we made sure to always include like a part in the budget that was like, hey, we need people to come in and help us because we have our main writing people, but we don't all have the same, we might not have this experience that we're writing about. So we need people to come in and help and do this. And so that was kind of how we did it. We just made sure that whoever was writing it and doing it experienced it in some degree.
I'm kind of curious about kind of the relationship that you have with, I guess, fans or like the fandom. It seems like it's a show that has people who feel really passionately about it. And so I'm kind of wondering what that's like. And also, I think you kind of even touched on it before, this idea of like, that it's almost like people have these feelings about the show and then kind of bring them back to you. And so like,
Yeah.
What is that relationship like, or what is that experience like?
It's very strange. It is a very unusual experience. It's not often when somebody just like, if you're just a normal person, right? And you work at a normal restaurant or like whatever, it's not normal for you to get emails from people that were at the restaurant that then say, you know what, your food was so meaningful to me. And I remember experiencing everything that happened with this food when I was a kid. And so it just was extremely meaningful to me. And, you know, I just wanted you to know. And like going on long descriptions of everything that has ever happened to them that's like this emotional, torturous thing, and being like, your show means so much to me, your food means so much to me. I mean, that's what happens is people say like these really long, wonderful things, and I totally thank them, and it's so nice that, as I said, you know, I want the art that I'm making to, you know, connect with people, and it's wonderful that it's connected to them. But it is an odd sort of relationship that you have to, it just takes time to get used to. I generally try to keep people at a certain amount of distance, because I've seen many a show creator crash and burn when they got too involved with fans. And it's purely a, you know, professional thing. Like for example, I never say the name of my wife anywhere. I took her down from every single piece of media that I had. Like I, you know, just cause I don't want anyone to like bother her over things. I I've seen people have really strange ideas about what their relationship is with show creators sometimes, where it's that sort of parasocial thing, where it's like they seem to have a very different understanding of what the relationship is between fan and creator than the creator would have, you know? And I understand why those things happen. And so I try to be as like, you know, open as I can, and like not put anyone down for having those sorts of feelings or things like that. But it is a very complex relationship that you're not always prepared for. Because that's I was really lucky that I worked on regular show for a few years to sort of get used to the idea of people contacting me about stuff, about like whatever, you know, about like some relationship between some character, like whatever, blah, blah, blah. So I sort of got used to it to a degree, but then when the show sort of blew up, it's just like, it's really weird that you can look up your name on the internet and see thousands of people talking about you. You know, that's a very, very strange position to be in. And it can really, really mess with you. And it has messed with me. It's made me, sometimes it's really just made me like completely freak out. Like I'll just be in my house and I'll just have like this sort of like anxiety attack, knowing that like there was this one random person that was saying something really weird about me, and like someone else responded to them and was like, oh, he really did that, or like whatever it is. And so it ends up with this weird, so that's often, I take a break whenever I realize that's happening. I like do a whole purge and I go like, all right, shutting down everything for like a week. But it really can mess with your brain.
Yeah, I think I was reading through your AMA that you did on Reddit when season 4 came out, and I think you just do a really good job of, because like Ben said, so many of the fans have all these different theories and ideas and potentialities that the show could go in, and I think you do a great job of like humoring those, but not kind of, reveling in them for too long. And I'm just curious. I'm sure you learned so much from making the show. I'm sure like every episode brought some new lesson, but what do you think now that the show is at its conclusion? Like what's something that you're really taking away from it, from finishing it, and or what that you're thinking about right now?
It's usually the responsibility of it. Like when you're, and I also thought this when we were making it, but I still think about it now, which is just like when you are someone who is making a piece of media, whatever it is, whether it's just an image, whether it's a piece of writing, a piece of music, anything, other people are going to see it. They're going to see it and they're going to take something away from it. So whatever it is that you're doing, you better make sure that it's worthwhile and that whatever it is that you're saying is something that, isn't bad. like don't hurt people. That's basically it. Like if what you're saying is going to intentionally cause harm on somebody, just don't do it. Because there's really no reason to do that except to somehow like boost yourself or make yourself better. And so I've, if you follow my Twitter, I think people would definitely know that like I delete tweets all the time. And it's because that's what happens. I'll say something and I'll be like, that's not actually helping anything for anybody, and I'll just delete it. I delete, I delete all of my Twitter like once a year because I'm like, it doesn't matter. All these things don't matter. So, yeah, it's mostly just the responsibility of like whatever it is that I'm making, like with Infinity Train stuff, like it's going to be seen by millions of people. So I better make sure that whatever I'm saying is worthwhile. Yeah, that's kind of it.
Is there something we're not asking you about, the show or kind of your life as a creator that is something maybe you want to touch on?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I think there is a general, a couple of things that I always wish is that people understood that the show creator is really just one part of the whole thing. I came up with the seed of an idea and I oversaw and I helped things happen, but it's a very, very collaborative thing. And it's not, people often will just give all the credit to some show creator, and it's like, it's not, it's everybody else who worked on the show that makes it what it is, because they're all putting their collective brains into working on this thing and bringing their own truth to it. So this idea that it all comes from some genius singular vision is absolutely wrong. And also that, show creators and showrunners and all those sorts of people, they're all just people, and they're people like anybody. Like, I grew up in a rural part of Minnesota, and then eventually I was able to move to Los Angeles, and eventually I was able to make a TV show. Like, there's no, like, if you're some kid who's in rural Wisconsin or rural Minnesota or something, there's a path. You can go do this thing. It's going to have a lot of obstacles, and every obstacle for every person is going to be very different, and some people will have more than others. But it's not, I think sometimes people forget that whoever it is that they're talking to has a whole past and has a whole life before the moment that they met them, and everyone's just a person. Like, I view that might or might not have been a problem occasionally when I've worked for people, as that I view people above me as like, you're just a guy, versus the people below me as the same, like, you're just some guy, no matter how famous they are. So I would say, people are just people. Like, just keep that in mind when you're talking to somebody online, that's all.
Well, I think that's everything that we've got. I don't know, Ben, did you have anything else? But
That's I'm tapped out. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
yeah, This was really fun.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, I liked it.
Good, nice. Okay.
Yeah, it was fun.
Hey, thanks everybody for listening. That was our conversation with Owen Denis. Phil, yeah, I think, I guess I've been thinking about, like, this was a great conversation to have, almost, thinking about the relationship Owen has to this show. And I think you can kind of hear him that in a lot of ways, it's like still kind of raw, that he's like almost in some ways like saying goodbye to this show.
Yeah. And there is a lot to think about in terms of, the public's response to a show. Like, Owen talks a lot about like fan response and, making sure to have some kind of distance between fans while also still engaging, but also just, like, one thing that I always struggle with is, my response to people's response to my work, and like the fact that it's out there, and what do you do with it? Or like, what if you have an idea that you weren't able to fully complete, like maybe you started getting something out there, how do you move forward? And I love the part where Owen's talking about how, like, in this day and age, not everything, like, nothing really dies, like there's always a chance for something to come back, and maybe in a new form. And if anything, I'm just interested to see if Infinity Train were to come back, or whatever Owen does next, to see what kinds of inventive world he's able to spin up in relation to, again, just like the emotional through line in the show is so unexpected when you're just looking at the images. And that I think is one of the benefits of animation that you don't get in the same way in live action. So I'm hoping we get more shows like Infinity Train, whether it's in continue somewhere else or we get something new.
Yeah, and I think just like this idea that he touches on of a show like this that is really personal, people end up having really personal reactions to it, and that it's like hard to disentangle, you know, people's relationship to a work of art you have created and also people's relationship to you personally, and that like those boundary lines I think can get crossed, and how important it is, you know, to kind of lay a boundary down, right? To be like, I am not the show. Like, I am a person that is independent from this thing despite having created it. Is really interesting, and I think is like a broader conversation that I think a lot of both kind of artists and people who are just online in general have, right? Where it's like, oh, how do you disentangle yourself from the things that you've created?
For sure. So you can find Owen at Twitter at Owen with 5 E's, Denis. And you can stream Infinity Train on HBO Max. Season 4 just came out back in April. So stream it. You know, this show is still kind of popping off. So there's still hope that it can be revived. So, you know, get on it, check it out. It's worth seeing. And, you know, thanks again to Owen for hopping on the show and giving us his perspective, not only on Infinity Train, but the creative process. It was a really eye-opening conversation, especially kind of getting some insights around just the cartoon business. That's something that I didn't have a whole lot of insider idea of how that stuff is made. So I appreciate the honesty in that regard.
Yeah, as always, like, thank you to folks for taking the time to talk to us. You can find us at @originstory_. Phil, where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter at 3DCisco. And where can they find you, Ben?
At sad_radio_lad. And you can find our website at originstory.show. Is that right?
Originstory-show, baby. Thanks to Ryan Hopper for providing the awesome intro and outro music that you hear every episode. And thanks to Melody Hirsch for giving us the great cover art.
If you have questions, concerns, ideas about who we should talk to next, or some questions that you want to ask, or even maybe if you want to tell us about your favorite taco toppings, you can hit us up over Twitter, or you can email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com.
That's it for now, but we will be seeing you all here next week on the next episode of Origin Story.
Bye!